Great, thanks. And welcome to the Climate Council Science and Data Committee for September 22nd. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a quorum here, and because I think the discussion could be fairly robust going forward here. So or at least I hope it is. On the agenda today, sorry, I'm not in my office, and I moved my monitors back to my office, but the internet went in the building. So I may struggle here with documents, but on the agenda, we don't have approval of minutes today because our meeting was just last Friday, where it was, the minutes will be out probably today or tomorrow, and then we can approve those next time. But we'll have an update on equity facilitation really briefly, talk about the definitions. That's the real substance of this meeting, I think, is to talk about the definitions that I sent around on Monday, I believe, of technological feasibility and cost effectiveness. I have a brief update on the meeting between the greenhouse gas task group of this committee and the ag and ecosystem subcommittee task group, and then cover any miscellaneous items and next steps before public comment. Are there any changes or additions to the agenda? Okay, hearing none, I would I just want to make two comments. One is that I am going to transition at 3:30. I have to transition to phone, so I won't be on the screen anymore. And then I will have to leave at 3:45, so a little bit early. I apologize for that, but and then I appreciate everybody's commenting on the doodle polls and scheduling this meeting, and turns out we ended up with this same time, although the start time may vary, but we have this time blocked off on Wednesday afternoons that we will just keep going forward. With that, I want to just give a brief update on the equity facilitation, and Jared, you could fill in where I left off here, but Kaya Morris has now been contracted with the state to help with equity facilitation on the for climate action and all the actions that various subcommittees are putting forth. This subcommittee, I don't know that we have tons of actions to put forward. We're talking about the accounting for greenhouse gases. We're talking about the climate impact, front matter of the plan, the work that Leslie Ann is doing. And we're talking about definitions here. That said, I wanted to, and the last piece, I think, monitoring and assessment, and how we collect and track data. And I wanted to just raise that contract has been signed and we'll have that assistance, although I think Kaya is going to be very busy, that there are a couple of areas where we may want to keep in mind that those resources are available. One is with the definitions we're drafting here, and we can infuse that into the conversation today. But the other is with the monitoring and assessment. I think there could be implications towards just transitions to the extent we talk about data gaps, data needs, that it could be useful to have Kaya's review to help us think about the implications of anything we put forward for just transitions. So we had a long discussion just this afternoon, 1 to 2, and Kaya's contract was signed at like 12:30, I think, so she got started right away. But this afternoon, and that really focused on how are the committees going to prioritize their actions that they're recommending with the foundational criteria that they need to prioritize on. One of them being just transitions in the rubric, that the scoring rubric. How is Kaya going to help prioritize? How will the committees do that? And so we made some progress. The chairs are going to all meet individually with Kaya. So Jared and I have that task. And I think that's the full update. Jared, is there anything else that I missed there?
Yeah, I think that was a great overview, TJ. I would just add that my sense is that the main priority for Kaya is going to be working with the cross-sector mitigation, ag and ecosystems, and rural resilience subcommittees, because those are the ones most focused on putting actions forward in the climate action plan. So I want to kind of respect that priority because they have a lot of work to do. But at the same time, I think that if there are science and data subcommittee members who want to raise topics, and I think that you raised some good ones, TJ, that we should have on a list to discuss where Kai's consulting support could help us, that would be great to elevate and know about. But I do think, as you said, TJ, it's really the top priority at this point seems to be helping prioritize actions and then analyze those proposed actions and figure out how to make sure that they're put forward in a way that respects the just transitions principles and in light of the equity rubric. And we just don't have many of those actions in terms of mitigation, adaptation, or resilience.
Thanks, Jared. Are there any thoughts or questions on that facilitation update? Okay, hearing none. I'm going to move into the definitions of technological feasibility and cost effectiveness. So those on Monday, a small task group, Jared, myself, and Colin Smythe got together to talk about these definitions, right after our Friday meeting, assigning that task group. And so there was a couple other people that were interested in attending, but the schedules didn't work out. So we met, 8:30 Monday morning, and thanks, Jared did some legwork, and we talked about the definitions a bit, and sent around definitions as a starting point for discussion.
A draft.
So, right. Very much a draft. And so, like I said, we had the meeting Monday morning, and then we sent them out Monday afternoon. So there's, I guess I'm just re-emphasizing that these are a draft, and we really want to have discussion and thoughtful discussion about this. And a couple of folks did comment. I'm not sure if Secretary Moore, that's you on the phone or not, but Julie was one of the. Okay, great, good. Well, then I don't have to try and translate your comments, and then Richard also commented a bit. But what I'd like to do, I'm going to pull up on the screen the document, or try to, and then we can go over those. Okay, so can people see my screen here?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'll just start with technological feasibility, which I may be the easier one here, may not be. As soon as I ever say that about anything, it becomes more complicated than I think. But and so we source the definition directly from the IPCC on technological feasibility, the degree to which the required technologies are developed and available. And there's a couple of notes here that we just wanted to put in for people's consideration, and that just generally we considered having it be a broader definition. There's a definition of feasibility that really talks about the geophysical, political or institutional, economic, other types of feasibility. But in terms of making this something that is understandable and clear, we thought it best to narrow the scope of technological feasibility to really focus on technology itself. And so that's what we did. And I guess I will I'll see, Jared, if you want to put any more color around it, there's probably more to provide, but I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we were aware of and trying to avoid is that in the earlier draft definition of technical feasibility, there were questions around, how much something would cost. And we felt like that was very much a consideration in the cost effectiveness or cost benefit analysis, and the degree to which we can really try to clearly delineate definitions and not mix too much up in one definition, which is why we wanted to very clearly say, this is what technological feasibility is, what is at the top of the screen right now. But then to note that, of course, does not exist as it's on its own. And there's other criteria that we've already been talking about and these other enabling conditions. We hoped that would be a clearer and elegant solution than trying to define feasibility across the board for everything kind of under the sun.
Thanks, Jared. So I guess we'll open it up for discussion, and Julie, if you're traveling and don't have it in front of you, I could try and communicate your comment, or I'll open it to you as well.
No, I'd appreciate that. I don't have it in front of me. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to pull it up exactly. I apologize. I thought I was going to have it ready to go. So I think and just please correct me if I'm wrong, there's just a question on what does available mean when we're talking about technologies that are developed and available. And Julie, I think, gave the example of EVs are available, but there's a limited supply in Vermont that's largely beyond our control. I think another example could be something like renewable natural gas or hydrogen, right? They're technologically possible, feasible, but are they really available to Vermont? And so I think the suggestion, those last two examples were mine, not Julie's. But a suggestion that Julie, you made was like a modifier, like reasonably or widely available could be appropriate.
Thanks.
Hopefully,
TJ.
yeah, sure. Hopefully, I accurately reflected your comment. What do folks think about?
Very much so.
I have an immediate reaction, but I'm also happy to wait and see if others do.
I can't see everybody's hand or everybody's squares here. So if you want to jump in, please do.
Julie, I really appreciate what you're saying. And I think I broadly agree with like that as a consideration. I guess my worry about saying that in the definition would be, I'm just thinking on different timescales. Like, this is probably too simplistic to say it this way, but my sense is that as demand grows and as we have the ability for market transformation, the supply will follow. And of course, there are economies of scale that are likely going to become possible as different technologies ramp up. But I guess what I would be wary of is if we say, okay, there's only about 4,000 electric vehicles in Vermont. And, like if we say, well, that's not readily available, I think the availability and the supply is a function of demand. And if we're setting targets for 2025 and 2030, those market conditions are going to change. And so I almost think like, whether or not, in terms of supply and demand in this readily available question, I think that's going to show up in prices. And if the supply doesn't come up to meet the demand, the prices are going to increase. So I think that gets taken care of potentially in the cost effectiveness definition. what I was initially thinking was more important to do with the technological feasibility definition is to say, look, we need to focus on things that we know actually exist, that are proven and available, rather than things that are kind of on the drawing board or are seen as theoretically possible, but the technology is not yet, beyond a prototype or something. So those are some. So I guess for that reason, I would suggest that we leave it as is, and that the kind of readily available comes into play more in the cost effectiveness questions in terms of limitations on supply. But I think that's going to be really dynamic as we go through massive market transformations. I mean, we're seeing already exponential growth in heat pumps. I think we had 10,000 installed this year, 5,000 the year before, 2,500 the year before. And so if we had said at a point a few years ago, well, heat pumps aren't readily available, but now they are because supply is growing to meet demand, as I think is the case for forecasts for auto EV makers and others. So those are just some of the considerations that come to mind for me.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jared, and I agree that it's a dynamic area. I guess my concern is particularly to the extent we're looking at how to structure an incentive program or even a requirement. If these things aren't available on the market for purchase, whatever they are, be it a clean heat standard, EV requirement, time of transfer requirement on building heat systems, I don't know where that puts us, and I'm not sure it fully gets captured by cost. But also, I very much agree with your notion there that it's going to be a dynamic set of conditions that change over time, and that was why I'd hoped some sort of modifier could at least leave open the door for that conversation, because I think otherwise it could be interpreted to be a hard and fast, does this thing exist, not does it exist and is readily available.
Mm-hmm.
What about, is the current concern alleviated with a modifier that's more developed and available or expected to be available? That might get to Jared, the concerns you're expressing, and also the renewable natural gas example I came up with is that I don't think anybody's expecting 100% of our demand to be available to be met by renewable natural gas. And maybe that's not true, but we could argue over that.
Yeah, I appreciate the attempt there, TJ. I do think that expected to be available could lead to more problems, because then we could be saying things about technologies that aren't yet proven. So it helps us move forward. I would say that I am more comfortable. I mean, even though it's a broad term, I'd be more comfortable with the modifier of reasonably than readily, and would be okay with that.
That would be great from my perspective too. I think it just leaves open room for the conversation. So thank you, Jared. Hopefully others agree too.
Does anybody object to adding reasonably into the definition? Okay. All right, good. I think that was about the amount of time we had allocated for that technological feasibility discussion, so that we're on track here. So next up is the cost effectiveness discussion. And Jared, I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you want to introduce this one, since you
Sure. Well, I will say that I drafted sentences 2 and 3 because, and I should say that I did this fully knowing that it was not sufficient, because we need, what the council wants is a definition for cost effectiveness that is not just about mitigation, but that is also about adaptation and resilience. The challenge for me, and I think why TJ made the attempt at the first sentence, is, the definition of cost effectiveness for greenhouse gas mitigation is really clear in the literature. It is, the lowest cost per ton avoided of greenhouse gas emissions avoided. I am not as clear. I think others have done some research and may be able to help us here, what the cost per fill in the blank would be for assessing adaptation and mitigation measures. If we're trying to figure out cost-effective pollution reduction, it's how much pollution can you reduce at what cost, or greenhouse gas pollution. So we felt fairly confident about that definition there, but then we realized, well, that leaves open the question of cost effectiveness in the other areas. And so that led to the first sentence, which I appreciate. I also worry, I think Richard noted this, that it might muddle the issues between cost effectiveness and benefit cost analysis. TJ,
can I say something here?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would be happy with this definition if you took out that first sentence. I don't think you should let measurement issues, the difficulty of measuring effect, that you shouldn't let that determine what your definition is. You want to measure you want to know what you're getting for your expenditures, and that concept is what cost effectiveness is about. The fact that it's sometimes hard to measure doesn't change the concept.
Yeah, so the reason that I guess it's really the context of what the council needs to do, right? So cost effectiveness, in quotes, is what a prioritization metric for evaluating these different strategies. And to me, that it's kind of, instead of what is the dollar per ton or dollar per something, it could be, you could even boil it down to a yes no question. Once you apply a benefit cost analysis, something is either cost effective or not, and then it matters.
See, I think you're mixing concepts.
Well,
Sorry.
maybe no, but just hear me out. Maybe so there's also a ranking of actions you could take based on this, dollar per ton, or dollar per resilience measure, or dollar per how much we've adapted, which like Jared, I don't know how to define, but it's like, are these measures cost effective? Well, if we've counted the damages like that we could otherwise pay for, and what we've agreed is the value for that, the damages for climate that we're avoiding. If we've counted the health impacts and all these other co-benefits, and I know that those are very hard, the stack of benefits is very hard to put a dollar sign to, then you could say you're putting a value on whether this is a good thing to do or not. And then secondarily, that's when you say, okay, this is a yes, no, or it's close, it's within the range of, there's going to be a range of outcomes because there's uncertainty on what you're avoiding and the values, but those are within the range that we want to maybe pursue. And then you go rank them on the specific purpose that you're trying to achieve of mitigation. So I do think they're two different things, and and maybe that first sentence doesn't fit in this definition of cost effectiveness, but that's functionally what we have to do, isn't it?
Well, my view would be that first sentence belongs in your definition of benefit cost analysis.
I jump in here a little bit. I think part of the challenge is otherwise we end up with a definition of cost effectiveness that is limited exclusively to mitigation options. And I think part of our challenge is to try to come up with a way to make comparable, or at least allow people to have eyes into different investment
you're
strategies that include
you're
adaptation and
breaking up.
sequestration. Oh, am I?
No.
I think it's just
Can
on
you hear me
TJ's
now?
end. No, we can hear you, Julie.
Okay.
I think we just lost
I
TJ.
just saying. Oh, okay. So really, my concern is trying to create a frame of reference somewhere that allows for a basic comparison between the different types of activities. And I am concerned that with a cost effectiveness definition measured only in greenhouse gas emissions, adaptation doesn't fit, and I'm not sure what we do with it.
Madam Secretary, I think there's just an editing problem here. My view is that cost effectiveness analysis is a technique. It's a broad technique. And I agree with you that I don't think we should be limiting cost effectiveness analysis to one kind of outcome measure. We have lots of different outcomes we're interested in, and reduction of releases of greenhouse gases is one of them. But there are other outcomes we're also interested in, and we can estimate the cost per unit improvement in those other outcomes as well.
Yes, and I think it's just, then what is the unit? Right?
Well, that's why economics is hard. This kind of applied economics is hard, and part of the art of doing it well is figuring out how to measure the left-hand side and how to measure the right-hand side, what to include and what not to include, what kind of data sources to use. It's not just easy peasy thing to do.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, Richard, I think that article that you shared is very helpful and helps clear up the situation in terms of the actual equations for cost effectiveness and benefit cost analysis. I wonder if one thing that we could do, I
put that link in the chat.
I wonder if one thing that we could do is just take that first sentence out of the cost effectiveness definition, add to the cost effectiveness definition that for purposes of adaptation and resilience, we're talking about the cost per desired outcome. I mean, that's really how that equation is set up, the cost per desired outcome. And then for adaptation and resilience measures. And I know that leaves it broad and open, and it asks for more work from the subcommittees that are really focused on that. But I don't know how to fill in that blank without just saying the cost per desired outcome for adaptation and resilience. Is it per? Yeah.
Right, it's an avoided cost in general on adaptation and mitigation for adaptation and resilience, right?
Well, I think the avoided cost could show up in that primary benefit cost analysis definition, which I think is sufficiently broad that that it could be useful for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, because we are articulating that we want both sides of the ledger there in terms of benefits and costs, and not just short, but also long-term. There's some other pieces in there. But I feel like that, at least that second definition, is inclusive of all of our charges, not just mitigation. The question is, how do we square this cost effectiveness definition to be able to at least start, maybe not finish, but start speaking to the adaptation and resilience goals?
So can I add
Is there a
something?
reason we couldn't? Oh, go ahead, Richard.
So there are going to be many programmatic efforts that are generated by the council's activities. I don't know what they all are yet, but for example, you might have a program that's designed to enhance adoption of electric vehicles. It might have a program that's designed to enhance the availability of electric vehicle charging stations. You might have a program designed to increase the weatherization of low-income persons' homes. And there are going to be alternative approaches to doing each of those things. And those different approaches are going to cost different amounts of money for the state agency that does them. And so there's an opportunity to do cost effectiveness analysis over and over with all the different elements of the programs that are put in place as part of the eventual plan. I don't think this emphasis on just the avoided emissions is limiting. That's not the whole story.
So, sorry, I dropped off. I don't know what happened there with my internet, but I guess I'm okay with removing that first sentence in cost effectiveness, but I also don't think that definition is cost effectiveness. It's just the cost. It's cost per unit of whatever we're trying, and it's not really a definition of cost effectiveness. And I think that's where I've been getting hung up. And really, the cost effectiveness is something different, and it's really more goes to the benefit cost analysis that needs to be done.
TJ, if that's good for you, I know that we've got an agenda and eventually we're going to do some other updates. I would really like to see if we can get to resolution on this, because I don't think we're going to be able to on the kind of inventory and accounting conversation with ag and ecosystems. So I put in the chat some language that we could add at the end if folks are amenable to that. I'm not saying it's perfect or finished, but as a starting point. And maybe that sentence actually goes between.
So if you could cut and paste that back into the chat, I don't see it because when I was out, off.
I accidentally directly chatted it instead of to the group.
While Jared's doing that, if I can just, I think to echo what Jared said, I think in terms of process, if science and data can come to some sort of decision about the definition of cost effectiveness and how to best include those adaptation and resilience benefits. I think Brian put something interesting in the chat where for mitigation and resilience, it's for looking at risk reduction. And so one potential way to think about it is if we need, this would be tough, but if we needed two separate definitions, it makes it difficult to compare. But if we're looking at a specific measure of greenhouse gas reduction for mitigation and then something about risk reduction for adaptation and resilience, it's going to be hard to compare anyway. So perhaps two separate definitions would help. But just acknowledging what Jared said about if we could really come to resolution on this, that would be great.
And I know that desired outcome is very broad, but I'm hoping it's broad enough to enable us to move forward and then basically ask the committees most focused on this to help us refine it over time, but at least it gives us a starting point.
So I guess I'm just so I like the cost per desired outcome, but again, when I'm just trying to take this to its conclusion of this definition goes before the council, it's in the prioritization framework. Other committees take this for their actions and say, okay, we need to prioritize, and we are prioritizing based on the cost per desired outcome. Is that?
I think it's going to naturally lead to the question of what is their desired outcome, which may not be easy to answer, but I also don't think we can answer that for them. And I do think it is a step forward. Maybe actually, now that I look at this more closely, I wonder if we need to add the word lowest before net cost.
No.
Okay. Because it is just, arraying on a spectrum. That's right, for comparison. Yep.
Well, how are they ranking though? We need to give them something. So,
when you're making public decisions, you can rank them on effectiveness, you can rank them on cost effectiveness, you can rank them on cost benefit. You can rank them on what proportion of the problem you solve with your effort. And there's a lot of different ways to assess program effectiveness, and these are just two techniques, important techniques for doing that.
Right, and this, we were asked, so this is why I was trying to clarify the ask, is that there's 5 foundational criteria that they're intended to prioritize on, and this is one of them. And so it's not the only thing in terms of policy that committees are intended to prioritize on. And so I some of those other things of effectiveness at the solution or co-benefits, do they gonna hit, maybe they have a whatever the cost per desired outcome is, but they also help with adaptation and resilience, and so they have these co-benefits, or it's a really just and equitable solution. And so it's not the only criteria, but for this one criteria, I think we need to give some guidance of, is lowest better? Is highest better?
Just because I know that everybody who's on didn't see this in the chat or wasn't able to pull it up, I'm just going to briefly, if it's okay, share my screen, because I think there is,
Sure.
based on what, I think I need permission. But based on the link Richard shared, I know sometimes when we share equations, it can get confusing. I think this is an instance where sharing an equation actually makes things clearer. Can folks see this?
Make it bigger.
So I'm going to highlight that and see if I can, what is it? Control plus, get bigger. There we go. So this is, I think, helps clarify the distinction between cost effectiveness and cost benefit analysis. So for those who are on the phone, it would be cost effectiveness equals the costs divided by the outcome, whereas cost benefit analysis or benefit cost analysis is the benefits divided by the costs. So they're certainly related, and I think, but I do think that they're distinct and should be treated separately, and that we want to try to avoid conflating or muddying them.
So this is helpful to bring back up. I did skim this, but I didn't internalize it, I don't think. I think I'm okay if we say the cost effectiveness is the cost per desired outcome, and we could say, for example, the mitigation options are, as the language is, and then below that, it's in calculating the costs. This is what we need to do, which is really the benefit cost analysis. The second part of what I had up on the screen previously.
Yeah. I think that would work.
I think that gets at a lot of my concerns too.
Okay, so we had until 3:30 on this topic, so I'm going to share my screen again and actually try and put that in so that we can actually just do this now. Can people see that now?
Yep.
Maybe we could, let me know if you think we should say net costs.
I apologize, everyone. I have to drop off now for another commitment.
Thanks, Julie. I think hopefully, just Julie, we'll wordsmith this and then send this around, and hopefully that folks can confirm that the language is good. I think there's a desire for us to bring this up at the next Climate Council meeting, and if it's ready, which is Tuesday, if it's ready, that would be.
I agree, and I'll look forward to seeing the revisions. Thank you.
Yep, thanks. Um, in Okay, so that's what I think we just talked about, more or less. Hopefully more.
Yeah, I might just say in parentheses after cost there, TJ, or savings, recognizing that it could go in either direction. And sorry, on that second definition.
Oh,
If I can just add something to think about, I think something you brought up earlier, TJ, about putting this into practice. So thinking about the subcommittees using this, particularly rural resilience and agony ecosystems, for one component of their evaluation of actions. Would it then result in a number, like a dollar amount, or are you all thinking of some other ranking or high, medium, low assignment of criteria? I guess, what does this look like in the output is what I'm wondering.
I have a response, but I'll let others go first if they want. So I think I would say that if quantifiable, it should be quantified, but if not, then the committees should use their expert judgment to determine they think the net costs per outcome are high, medium, or low, or negative.
Yeah. At the risk of being unhelpful, but in hopes that I will actually be helpful, I'm going to share my screen again, because I have we can share an example of how this plays out in the mitigation space. I think that a similar thing could happen in the other spaces. It would take a lot of work, but so let me just, so if folks can see this. This is known as an abatement cost curve or a greenhouse gas reduction curve, where you're looking at different measures or actions, and they're ordered based on how much they're kind of, cost per desired outcome. The desired outcome here is reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and basically all of them get lined up across a spectrum, and you see net costs or net savings to do these. This is a global example, not a Vermont example, but you could imagine that if there are a whole set of desired investments or actions in the mitigation or adaptation space, you could say, first, let's define the outcome we're desiring, then divide the costs by that outcome and come up with a similar spectrum of, to assess the cost effectiveness of those different measures or actions relative to your desired outcome. So I hope that's helpful. But like over here, these are things that actually don't cost anything. They save you money to do. And so, whereas here, and then where this zero line gets put depends on depend on the benefit cost analysis. Specifically, oftentimes what you see is if you apply a value, a social cost of carbon value to a curve like this, the x-axis at 0 would move up to whatever that price of carbon is, in terms of the net cost being above or below that. But I hope that's helpful as an example. And I think that if there's a whole suite of measures or actions that those subcommittees are focused on, if they could get cost data and if they could agree on their desired outcome, it would be possible to generate types of graphs, which I know is one of the deliverables for the consultants on the kind of mitigation pathways and action side.
Yeah, I think just that is helpful, Jared, but I do want to highlight that has been the hard part of conversations within agony ecosystems and rural resilience, is that it is it is hard to measure the benefits of many of these actions because there's not as clear, as you noted, there's not as clear science and reporting and sort of consensus around those definitions behind those sectors of work. So in reality, I think many of these actions are going to be rated at like a high, medium, low scale. And if science and data, and I know this is tough, but as much guidance as you all can provide to the Climate Council on Tuesday about what might translate to a high, medium, low, even if it's, I think that would be helpful because the subcommittees are looking for guidance ultimately from the council. If it could come from science and data for conversation at the council, I think that would be the best path to move forward in. But in being able to pull costs on specific outcomes, I think realistically that's going to be tough to do for many of their actions.
Yeah, and I'll note that that cost curve also includes potential, which is a hard one to, folks aren't going to be able to do that in this context. I wonder if well, I don't know this. I'll just be throwing something out there again, but it would be something like if in there, we should probably put this in the document, but in the subcommittee's expert judgment, or let me start over, that the subcommittee should apply the benefit cost analysis, these in their expert judgment, and may do it qualitatively if they need to. And it could be as simple as this is expected to have net benefits, or or it's unknown, or it's expected to have net costs, and have it really high level, because then those net benefits ones are really the ones that get prioritized, right? But that's just a suggestion. Sorry, I tend to just throw some things out there to move the ball, and sometimes they're not good, but it's what it is. Lou, see your hands up.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. I guess just to kind of add to that conversation, I like the way you phrased it. Certainly we would, encourage everybody to make use of the data they have, or the understanding that they have, to, be as precise as possible. But accuracy is an important part of this, and where there is uncertainty in some of these assumptions, that's something important to note. Not necessarily to say to create another metric, but a high, medium, low rating is only as good as the certainty with which you assign it. Same goes for a specific cost in any quantification, but it's something that we need to be aware of almost in parallel to some of our calculations and assumptions.
Thanks, Lou. I think that's a really good point. I'm not sure how to address that if it turns into a high, medium, 2 columns of this is high with high uncertainty, or net benefits with high uncertainty, or net benefits with low uncertainty. It turns into kind of a matrix like that. And recognizing that the subcommittees have at least the Agony ecosystems, I know, has like 150 actions that they want to prioritize. So that's a lot. Richard, I saw you have your hand up also.
As some of you know, I spent many years as a public health official, and we used cost benefit and cost effectiveness analyses quite a bit in our work. Many public health programs are cost saving. That is, they save more money than they cost to implement. Our childhood vaccination programs, for example, are cost saving. So that's a no-brainer. Many other public health programs are effective, but they're not cost saving. And when it's effective and not cost saving, then it's when you ask yourself, how much does each life saved cost you? How much does each year of healthy life added cost you to do this intervention? It was a continuing problem in the health departments where I worked that legislators often had this idea that all public health programs were supposed to be cost saving, and they're not, and they shouldn't be. We should be willing to spend public money to achieve public goods, to achieve public objectives.
Yeah.
And we do this all the time. We don't demand that our highways be cost saving or that our schools be cost saving. We support them because they do things that we think are important, and we want to do them in a reasonably economical way.
Yeah.
So you can argue about, is a particular strategy with respect to highways cost effective, or is one strategy more cost effective than another? I just want to emphasize that we ought not to be seduced by the idea that some of our activities might actually be cost saving and somehow eliminate consideration of others where we would spend public money to achieve public objectives. That's
Right. And
philosophy for you.
yeah, no, I thank you. I don't know if you can see my screen of a PowerPoint now instead of the document. Hopefully you can. And I just want to share this with this subcommittee because I realize that not everybody will have seen this if they haven't been to a council meeting probably, or been scouring the pages of the Climate Council website. And I think this gets to your point, is that this yellow section, I think, is what we're talking about, cost effectiveness, right? But there's 5 foundational criteria that go towards the prioritization, and impact is what you're really talking about, Richard. We don't want to lose sight of the impact when we're trying to narrowly define here. And so the impact and progress towards the requirement or goals, so mitigation and resilience and adaptation, whatever their desired outcomes ultimately are that are measurable. I think that fits in this greenish area here, light greenish area. But then there's these other ones as well, co-benefits, ones that, if it hits multiple marks, or, justice and equity. So I feel like our task is narrow on the cost effectiveness piece, but the committee has all of these other ones that they really, need to consider when prioritizing.
Yep.
So I want to go back to this. We only have a little bit more time here, and so I think some framing language we probably need to add. We're not going to get to today on maybe how they should do this in terms of a high, medium, low, or how to really apply this could be helpful. But I also want to get feedback on this primary benefit cost analysis here, because there's some things, decisions that are implied based on how this is written, that is, it kind of scopes the boundaries of what should be included and what shouldn't be included in a cost benefit test. And it really talks about benefits to Vermont and Vermonters, and then includes on top of that social and environmental externalities. When you think about the damages from from climate change, and the social cost of carbon value that was, that our committee recommended, a lot of those damages happen outside of Vermont's borders, right? They're developing countries are seeing the greatest impact. And even within the US, I think you could probably argue that the damages, at least thus far, have been outside of Vermont. And so this definition kind of makes a judgment call of saying, hey, we're focused on Vermonters. It's kind of a what might be called a total resource cost test plus plus greenhouse gas emission externalities, plus the social cost of carbon. And that has implications on other things. Like the one key example is easy to think of is within the electric sector. If we reduce our peak, we don't actually necessarily, we do avoid potential infrastructure or defer infrastructure. Those are real dollars, but also there's a cost to Vermonters that from regional transmission that Vermonters would just don't have to pay anymore because we've lowered the peak at the right time. And those costs are just shifted to other New Englanders. And there's not a social reduction in costs. It's just a Vermont reduction in cost. And so I wanted to highlight that here and get folks' feedback on that's what this implies.
If others want to speak up, please do, and feel free to interrupt me. I will just say that I feel like this achieves a good balance in terms of aiming to quantify the things that the costs and benefits that we have more control over, bounding it by the state of Vermont, since we're a Vermont Climate Council, but also recognizing the global based damages that our carbon pollution creates elsewhere via the social cost of carbon that we've already discussed in this committee and that we have a report and recommendation on. So I feel like it threads the needle of enabling us to speak to both, but does not make things so broad that we couldn't do the analysis. So I'll just offer that as my perspective. And TJ, I would invite you to say that I think another benefit of this is that it aligns with the approach broadly that is taken in other spaces. I don't know if you want to speak to kind of how efficiency programs are assessed, TJ.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I was on mute. It's closely aligned, but not exactly aligned. So energy efficiency for a long time has had Public Utility Commission orders saying you shall use the societal test. And this has been defined as more of a global test. And our office actually just recommended switching from a marginal abatement cost for emissions to social cost of carbon. So also consistent there. But it also looks at it from a social perspective. So it does not count those savings from those regional network service charges in the electricity example I just gave. It does not count the effects of energy efficiency actually having a price reduction effect on on electricity clearing prices for everybody in New England. Because those are transfer payments. Also, the societal cost, it would include federal tax credits because it's a societal cost. It's just like the total cost of the measure. I think this test would actually exclude that. So there are some differences, but it's based on the general concept there. And so, but I'll throw that out there. And then also I need to transition to phone now, which is why I stopped sharing. Jared, I just emailed you the document, so you may be able to share.
Okay, yeah, I will try to pull that up, and then I would actually, while I'm doing that, I think what I would suggest is we see if we kind of do a test for subcommittee support, see if we have consensus at a level of comfort in moving these definitions forward as we've revised them. I am sorry, I don't have that email yet. Oh, actually, Jess got it. Just a moment. Sorry, everybody. Oh, okay, good. So here we go. Can folks see my screen? Okay, so we already did that on technological feasibility. And this is where we were on cost effectiveness and primary benefit cost analysis. Is there anyone who would be uncomfortable with moving forward, moving these definitions forward as the suggested definitions from the Science and Data Subcommittee to the full council?
Jared, this is Lou. I guess quickly, maybe I missed the reason for it, but we have the first line of the primary cost benefit cost analysis. We also make reference to cost effectiveness. I'm not sure if that's contradictory or not.
Yeah, I think that that's okay, because we're just noting that in terms of figuring out this side of the ledger.
But Jared, you could leave out the in determining cost effectiveness, those words, and you wouldn't lose anything.
Yeah. So just start as it was with estimated?
No, to estimate cost and benefits, estimated benefits and costs shall be inclusive of.
Okay.
Or, or maybe that's even redundant.
Yeah, I think it basically says the same thing.
Both kinds of analysis require you to estimate costs. One kind requires you to estimate benefits in dollar terms, and the other requires you to estimate units of outcome.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, and then I should have shared, or we should have shared earlier, that we do have this note here that in many circumstances, additional benefit cost tests may be appropriate, just from a consumer's perspective or a public investment perspective, to just have additional information on assessing certain policies or programs. And these were some of the notes on the definitions that were included above. I think we wanted to ensure that there wasn't confusion about the lifetime of a measure. So which would be, in the case of home weatherization, I can't remember the exact lifetime of that measure. I think it's usually estimated somewhere between 20 and 30 years. There's going to be a reduction in cost or emissions estimated for that lifetime of that is different than life cycle emissions accounting. So we wanted to make sure to make that clear. There is this note as well, clarifying about how we define costs of greenhouse gases in terms of CO2 equivalent or for specific gases. But those are consistent with what we have already discussed and decided as a subcommittee. So, but I didn't want you all to not see those notes before we move forward.
Jared, just a question on that first of four notes there. Is the implication that additional benefit cost tests would be conducted by policymaking entities or would be included in the climate action plan?
I think, and TJ, if you're on the phone, please jump in, but I think the intent there was to we didn't want to suggest that additional benefit cost analysis should be precluded by this, just that this was the primary, the suggestion of a primary approach to benefit cost analysis for purposes of the council.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, this is TJ. I think that's right. At some point, I can't remember if it's in there, it probably isn't, but other tests like impacts to customers or, customer costs or, a program implementation cost really should be considered as well, because those are pieces of the trade-offs that need to be made when pursuing a policy and really inform for a customer perspective, it could really inform a just transition piece or just other aspects of what needs to be considered.
Any other questions or concerns before we move forward with these? Or assuming we want to? Okay, I am not the expert at facilitation, but I think, here, I'm gonna stop share so I can actually see everybody. I have not changed anything. I guess what I would suggest is, please speak up now if you're not comfortable with this being the recommendation of the Science and Data Subcommittee. See the note from,
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
so Jared, it sounded like what we had talked about, potential additional language for how the committee, other subcommittees may be able to apply this in terms of high, medium, or low, or net costs or net benefits, and then also potentially with a level of uncertainty applied to that. I feel like we need to have some language around that, otherwise, and share it with the subcommittee. I know there's this drive to have this ready for a Tuesday council meeting, but I want to be comfortable with that, and I think we're going to get the question anyway. And so, what I would suggest is that we develop that language and then talk about it again. Hopefully, it's a brief at our next subcommittee meeting, and have it be on the October 5th council meeting.
You know, the other option, TJ, would be to say, here are the definitions. There's some additional kind of guidance or context that we'd like to offer. I haven't heard, I guess I would be curious to see if people broadly agree with the way that you just framed this. I mean, I recognize that it's difficult to put it into words in real time in Wordsmith, but whether the subcommittee would be comfortable with you sharing that kind of general reflection on how these could be applied. But that does seem a step beyond the specific charge of asking for definitions. And I feel like if we're there on the definitions, I'd like to be able to at least have something to present. And I feel like what you're saying, I agree that it's valuable and important, but I think it could come up in conversation. And I would ask whether the subcommittee is comfortable with you basically sharing what you just shared with us, which I for one would be. I think it reflects the kind of tenor of the conversation that we had, recognizing that there's going to have to be some qualitative measures and some general high, medium, low ranking on some of these things for which quantitative measures are not easily available or easy to generate.
So just to respond, sorry, I can't see anybody, but thank you for bringing me back to what the ask was. I tried to stay there earlier, and I think the ask really is the definition, and I'm comfortable with that, even though I suggested something different.
Okay. And then Richard, I see your hand. I want to go to you next, but first want to note in the chat that Leslie Ann has raised the question whether Jay and Brian have been able to provide comments. I'll say from the email that was sent out, I did not receive, I don't know if you did, TJ, any feedback from Jay or Brian, and I'm not sure if, I don't believe Brian is on the subcommittee meeting today, and I don't know whether, I can't see if one of the phone numbers is Jay or not, so. But we do have, they had the chance to review it, and we do have quorum, so that would be my kind of initial thought, but Richard.
I have nothing more to say.
Okay. All right. So hearing that, we will forward these definitions onto the council as the recommendation of the Science and Data Subcommittee Hearing no objection to that. Thank you, everybody. This was a really helpful discussion, and I think that final product really benefits from the careful eyes and of many of you. Thank you in particular, Richard, for finding that article, which proved very helpful. Okay.
Thank you all. I just want to say I need to sign off. So thank you very much for that discussion, and we'll carry forward these recommendations and report back next week.
So I seem to have, unfortunately, in my screen sharing, lost my screen that had the agenda. If Marion, can you help me out here? Are we next on the update about the Agony ecosystems in the, okay.
All right, pulling it up now. I'll put the link in the chat, but yes, we are next up is update on Science and Data Subcommittee, Greenhouse Gas Task Force, and Agony Ecosystems Task Group discussion.
Okay. So I'm just going to set a little bit of context and share a brief update, and then would invite folks who are part of that conversation to add anything you think is important that I missed. And I see that Abby Corse is with us from the Agony Ecosystems Subcommittee, as is Lauren Oates, and Colin Smythe is with us, who is part of this conversation. So the context here is that after we had the Climate Council meeting on Tuesday, September 14th, there were questions related to how our subcommittee's recommendations with regard to the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and supplemental accounting would, what effect those would have or not have on some of the recommendations that were being developed by the Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee. And so we agreed that we would kind of put a pause on that, on moving forward our set of recommendations until we could have a conversation with folks who'd been focused on that from Agony Ecosystems. We did that yesterday afternoon from 2 to 3. It was a number of members of the Agony Ecosystems Subcommittee, including Abby and Lauren and Ryan Patch from the Agency of Agriculture, and then Richard, Colin, and myself representing the Greenhouse Gas Task Group of the Science and Data Subcommittee. I will briefly try to summarize that discussion. It was a long, hour-long discussion, but I think, and Abby and Lauren, please correct me if I phrase this incorrectly, but there was basically a 2-page set of recommendations that came out of Agriculture and Ecosystems that I think, to the degree there are recommendations around how we can more accurately inventory the gross emissions from the agricultural sector, there were no concerns. I think it gets to be a thornier question with unknown implications around recommendations that seem to be coming forward about basically changing our inventory methodology away from the methodology that is always used, which is gross emissions accounting. So like when you see every year for Vermont in the agency's inventory or an EAN report, the total emissions number from Vermont, this is a gross emissions figure for all of the sectors added up. Sounds like what Agony Ecosystems is recommending is they want to see net emissions accounting for ag done within the inventory, which would be create inconsistencies and I think create much larger problems with other sectors. So for instance, if you start doing net emissions accounting within the inventory, and I'm just talking about the sector-based in-boundary gross emissions inventory that has been the state's official inventory, not about a carbon budget. I think everybody supports more clarity on a carbon budget that would look at sources and sinks and be able to track sequestration better. But I think if you start doing it, and I would ask Colin to speak up here as well, but if you start doing net emissions accounting within a gross inventory, I think it could lead to some of the same challenges that we identified of trying to incorporate life cycle accounting into. They're just fundamentally different approaches. I think Maine's approach to this has been to have two separate inventory, or one carbon budget and one gross inventory. And I think it could lead to implications with other sectors that haven't fully been thought through in terms of on the forest side, on the fossil fuel side, do we start saying that it's an approved emissions reduction measure to allow for things like carbon capture and sequestration, which I think many folks see as not very real and of questionable realness and durability, for lack of a better term. So all that is to say, it opened up a much bigger question and kind of, I think, Pandora's box about trying to combine different approaches. I think if we can find a way forward where we agree on recommendations related to the inventory and its approach on gross emissions, which is what the Global Warming Solutions Act 2025 and 2030 targets are focused on, and at the same time identify a way forward on the carbon budget, that would be great. But I know that I, Colin, others have concerns about just moving to net accounting within our existing inventory, as seemed to be the recommendation of Agony Ecosystems. But I'm sure I missed important points there that others want to speak to. Richard.
Yeah, thanks. You did a masterful job. And Jared, many of the issues that you raised, although they were implicit in yesterday's meeting, were not brought out in yesterday's meeting the way you just brought them out, just to be clear on that. I heard what I heard from the man from the Department of Agriculture. Sorry, I don't know his name.
Ryan Patch.
Yes, thank you. It was a very passionate statement that basically said that leaving the inventory method the way it is and insisting that each sector make the same percentage reductions in 2025 and 2030 would be an existential threat to the farming community. And that's sort of my quick summary, and that if they have to make the percent reductions using the current metrics that are in the current inventory, they'll be out of business, or some of them will be. Now, you, Jared, you raised the point that, maybe enteric fermentation can be addressed, and it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game the way it was presented. But, I think I was very concerned at the end of yesterday's meeting that, that the presentation we were being given was that this was an existential threat. And people find it hard to compromise when they view their existence threatened. Anyway, that's my take on yesterday's meeting.
Yeah, I would just add to that I went back after the conversation and looked at the language that's in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And you can see, here's my copy, it's all marked up and written up, but I have written in the margin here that order matters. When it talks about the plan, it says it should further the following objectives. And the first objective it says in terms of emissions reduction is prioritizing the most cost-effective, technologically feasible and equitable greenhouse gas emissions. It's only after that has been established and prioritized that it speaks about relative contributions by sector. And so the point that Richard was saying that I made, and I want to make really clearly, is I think it's very important that we say, yes, we have to meet gross emissions targets, but I do not think that we should dogmatically say ag needs to be responsible for 16% because they're responsible for 16% of the gross emissions. And to me, that feels like a clearer path out that does not raise all of these other major challenges around how the inventory is actually done. But there's others in the queue. I just wanted to offer that clarifying point. Colin, please go ahead.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, I think this is it's a very interesting and complicated issue. I guess I want to throw out there that I think the point you just raised is an incredibly important one. And maybe Abby or Lauren could speak to this a little bit about whether if Science and Data or if the Climate Council were to put forward the recommendation or to clarify explicitly that these sector by sector percent reductions are not required, are not necessary, that it's based on cost effectiveness, would that kind of allay the fears of your group, or are you hoping to switch it to net more for the reason of being able to promote those management practices that you were talking about? And I totally appreciate that the management practices that you're bringing up that aren't included are beneficial. And I think we're just kind of caught in a strange accounting place. So I guess I just would love to get some clarity on if it were clarified that these proportional reductions didn't matter anymore. Like I think I mentioned on the call yesterday, this is also going to be a problem for the industrial processes sector. So you're not alone. And like in 2030, the industrial processes sector is going to have a hard time hitting those targets. So I think that's going to have to be addressed as well. But yeah, I guess I'm rambling on a little bit, but just curious about your thoughts as to if that would make this better, or if there's kind of more nuance that you would like to capture in there regardless of that.
Before we go to Richard, I see in the chat that Lauren said that she's not able to speak, but wants to invite Abby to offer some of her kind of summary or reflections from the meeting or where things stand now. If you're comfortable doing that, Abby, I don't want to put you on the spot, but.
No, that's fine. I'm happy to try to add context. I will be very frank. I am incredibly frustrated at this point. One, by the fact that what you are suggesting goes against what the IPCC recommends in terms of how agricultural emissions are calculated. And I fail to understand how Vermont would know better than the IPCC. Two, the issue is that the baseline of 16%, I have not been convinced of whatsoever in any of the information I've received that is an accurate calculation, because it's based on SIT, which takes information from the Midwest and other places that does not reflect the agriculture practices that happen on the ground in Vermont. In other words, there isn't a hayfield option. So hayfields are calculated as wheat fields. That's not even remotely the same thing. The other problem I have with this is some of what I think was coming up in the resilience and adaptation issues in terms of measurable goals and outcomes, which is the fact that the reality is that the agriculture sector operates within nature. Nature is a complex system. It does not respond in ways that other sectors can and do. And again, and just from a personal standpoint, it's really troubling to think that, my solar powered, entirely perennial pasture and non-tilled land and things like that aren't being counted as emissions reduction. So it leaves the baseline is inaccurate as far as I can tell. Nobody has provided me with any information to convince me that the baseline 16% is accurate. Two, we have been talking about this, Ryan, myself, Alyssa, Heather Darby, Dr. Galford, experts in their field with requisite experience in this have been raising this as a concern. And we continue to have to go through this. And it's starting to feel insulting, frankly, to the expertise of the people that have been working really hard on this. And I'm not really sure. I understand that it opens the Pandora's box of, and let's just put it out there, what is really going on, right? The carve out for ag, right? That we're going to let ag get away with something that another sector won't. The reality is that agriculture is a different sector. It doesn't function the same way. And you cannot hold it to things that it can't be responsible to, while at the same time wanting to use it for the benefits that it can provide for if Jared, if you don't take the sequestration and carbon storage as a realistic, then we'll talk about resilience and adaptation measures. In other words, if we do not empower our farm sector and our forest sector to employ methods that allow for resilient and healthy soils, adaptive farming communities, local food security, we are shooting ourselves in the foot and will only increase our greenhouse gas footprint in other places, which is deeply inequitable, and I don't think is the intention of any of us. So I understand it puts us in a difficult spot. It means we might have to explain ourselves. I think that's the moment that we're at. People, the average person is 3 to 4 generations removed from the farm. They don't understand this. Like, I get that these are hard conversations. We still have to have them.
Yeah, I actually am still not sure that we are clear on where we agree and disagree. I don't disagree with anything that you just said, Abby. I think my understanding, though, is that what Dr. Galford and you and Ryan and others have been focused on is developing a carbon budget that would enable us to do that. The problem, as I see it, is that we can't just take one sector and in our existing inventory and make that net rather than gross when the entire inventory is structured on a gross basis. I think that we should do exactly what you're doing, but in the context of a carbon budget. But I recognize we're running, I feel like this needs more conversation because I'm not sure we agree where we agree or know where we disagree fully yet, and it's worth more exploration. I know we're coming to time. I want to go to you, Colin, to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond to that exactly, except that we're not trying to shortchange. I'm certainly not trying to shortchange anybody. And I appreciate all the conversation and all the work that you put into it. I was not really looped into that conversation prior. But it comes back to gross versus net. And I don't know if you can, I don't feel personally like you can incorporate net with just the ag sector and not do the forest and land use sector. And that gets us into the problem of, do we have as a state, I just saw the carbon budget presentation the other day, and it doesn't seem to me like the data estimates coming out of the natural working lands are incredibly refined. And that's the message that I was taking from Dr. Galford. And so I don't know how you offset our kind of much more granular gallons of fossil fuel burned number with 5 million metric tons of carbon sequestered every year. That's an estimate that's come up with by the forest inventory analysis with a much larger spatial area. And frankly, I think a lot more assumptions. And I think they might be more accurate assumptions for the ag sector. I'm not confident that they're particularly accurate for the whole sector and wetlands, et cetera. So again, I don't know what the right answer is, but that's my concern with just straight adopting a net accounting mechanism. And I will just flag, like, all the other states in New England are not doing a net accounting mechanism right now. I think some are looking to do that as the data gets better, but it wasn't there last year. And I think it's going that direction, but I'm not sure if it's there yet or not. So I'd be happy to hear from kind of other experts who think that we can do this. And I will also just flag that, yes, it is the IPCC recommendation, but their goals are also, the Paris goals are net goals. Our goals are gross goals right now. So it's also not compatible at this current moment like that. And so I don't know where that leaves us, but, and I'm sorry, I'm sounding a little defensive now because I feel like I'm trying to get this right and trying to do it in a way that makes sense. And I'm happy to continue dialogue with that, but yeah, that's kind of where I am. Thank you.
So just recognizing where we're at time. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Colin. These are difficult subjects. I know we're trying to work through them together. I know that Jane is going to work to set up a second conversation with members of both of our subcommittees so we can try to figure out a way forward. We're clearly not there yet. This is not going to come up at the next council meeting, at least as an agenda item. We're going to have to put it off because it's important that we get some clarity and try to move to some shared understanding and agreement. I would just suggest that we do have, if there are any pressing updates, we did have that section of the agenda. If folks could briefly share those updates, if we need more time, we can build that into the next agenda. Please email TJ and I. Then as soon as we do that, I want to move to public comment. Dr. Dupini-Giroux, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Jared. Just to go back to the last few minutes, I just wanted to offer up maybe putting back some of the bigger picture thinking around a lot of this and why ag is such a unique piece in all of the things that we're looking at, both from a mitigation and adaptation perspective, and especially in terms of aligning with the US Department of Agriculture and their climate smart policies that do specifically address both adaptation, mitigation as co-equals. And so as we're thinking about this, if we can think about, again, like I said, in other contexts, a lot of this stuff that's coming down the pike from the federal level, so that we are in a very good position to put all of our sectors in the place that they need to be doing all of the good work that they need to do. So I know there's a lot of sort of granular stuff going on, but I think keeping our eye on the prize on some of those bigger picture pieces, and I think that's where a lot of the carbon sequestration and all of those other pieces need to sort of fit in.
Colin, is that a new, thank you, Dr. Dupini-Giroux. Colin, is that a new hand or is that an old hand?
I'm sorry, that's an old hand.
Okay. Are there any other subcommittee updates? Seeing no hands, let's move and open it up to public comment if anyone would like to share. And apologies that we were behind on the agenda. Okay. Going once. Okay. Thank you all for your time today, for working through these difficult subjects. And I know that many of us are committed to being in collaborative, constructive conversation together going forward, even if we're not there yet. So thanks. And we'll be in touch about the next agenda. If anyone has requested agenda topics or updates, please email those to TJ and I so we can work to craft our next subcommittee agenda. But otherwise, thanks, and everybody hope you have a good afternoon.